Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks. So I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about what I call one of my enthusiasms. And that word will become familiar to you at the end of today. Thanks. So I've been doing psych testing now for about 10 years. And in programs like Spark Academy, as well as wilderness therapy programs for the last 4. And what's really cool about that is that I've been able to...
As close as you can to this. It's annoying, but...
Okay, I'll talk really, really close. And so what's been really cool about that is that I've been able to start taking a step back and reflect on what it is that I've learned. And it turns out that the majority of what I've learned comes from your kids. So your kids have actually been my best teachers. And so I wanted to talk about something that I've been thinking about a lot recently, and when Spark decided they wanted to give me a microphone that I have to stand really close to, I took this as an opportunity. And what I wanted to say is this. We need to be more compassionate for what our kids are going through. They've left home and what is predictable and familiar, and they don't know exactly when they'll be back. And so, and a lot of them have gone through some pretty rough experiences, and they've kind of grown up feeling like they're a little bit different and that they are the sum of their weaknesses. Now, if that had been your experience, wouldn't you want some grace for your mistakes and your questionable decisions, some of your behaviors? And so my hope is that this talk is going to help you in taking their perspective, and with perspective it comes compassion. I always like to use metaphors when I work with parents because I find that it takes away the clinical jargon and it helps to understand what can be some pretty complex topics. And one of the ones that I thought about is this idea of playing Monopoly. So let's pretend we're all in a game night, and it's the biggest game night in recorded history, and we'll call Guinness, but we've all settled on playing Monopoly. And some of us have played Monopoly a bunch of times, and some of us are playing for the very first time. And for those of us who are playing for the very first time, we get the rule book and we kind of read it over, and as we start to play, some of us might make some mistakes, some of us might, break a rule inadvertently and we get called out on it. But eventually we kind of get fluent enough to be able to kind of play and, hopefully make some right moves and win some fake money. For your kids, when it comes to understanding the world around them, it's like playing Monopoly, but never have been given the rule book. We don't let them see it. And that can be a very frustrating experience, and nobody would blame them if they eventually just kind of say, forget it, this is too hard, I don't want to do this anymore. And so then we get the kids that spend all day in their rooms, meeting friends online, some, great friends, some not so great friends online, but they end up withdrawing from the world around them. I want to take credit for that Monopoly metaphor, but I didn't come up with it. It was a student of mine that I had recently worked with, and I thought it was so brilliant because it helped me understand their lived experience. And we don't do that often enough. We're so focused on our lived experience, which is ironic because when we talk about neurodivergent kids or kids on the autism spectrum, we're so focused on how they don't take our perspective and not how we don't take theirs. We need to seek and understand their perspective rather than expecting them to just understand ours. This is the case always, but especially if we're trying to help them. And I believe that this shift in perspective is how we can start to develop compassion for them. So let's see if I can, yep, it worked. All right. So none of our brains are exactly the same. Some of us are wired to be able to hyper-focus on an area that we are passionate about, and some of us can kind of toggle back and forth between different streams of thought. And then some of us can do both pretty easily. Some of us are musically gifted, and others of us are completely tone deaf. So, in other words, there is just this intrinsic natural diversity in human brain functioning. And so what does being neurodivergent mean? And some of you might have heard that word or heard the term neurodiverse or neurodiversity, but it's essentially a descriptive word that's describing someone whose brain processes information a little differently or in a way that is not typical, in air quotes. And if you guys have ever seen the gender or sexual identity umbrella, you've seen that there's a bunch of different terms underneath that umbrella. And the neurodivergent spectrum is just the same. And so it includes diagnoses like ADHD, autism, sensory and auditory processing conditions, dyslexia, dysgraphia. I mean, the list goes on and on. I really can't list them all. And so prior to the start of the neurodiversity movement in the 90s, clinicians almost exclusively viewed these differences as the root of the problem. But we started to see this shift in where we started to generate research and education into these different forms of brain function for the purpose of including what we called neurological minorities. We don't use that term anymore, so don't use that term. So we have a lot more research and education, and part of that is what I'm going to be talking about today. So the problem is that society's definition, and therefore what you and I and your kids have unknowingly internalized, is that there is a very clear and very ironic, rigid, black and white view of there's a dichotomy between neurodivergent and neurotypical, between having a disorder and not having a disorder. And so one of the things I've found in the students that I've worked with is that there is different strengths and challenges. And so I find that people who don't identify as neurodivergent or neurodiverse, they sort of coast in the middle where they've got some strengths, some things they're not so great at. And maybe you've seen this in your kids where they've got these sweeping strengths. I mean, some of them are the most talented artists I've ever seen, but kind of along with that, they've got some weaknesses that have been pretty debilitating in their life and have caused some problems. But is it possible that more of us than we originally thought are somewhere on that neurodivergent spectrum? Is it possible that many of the characteristics in our kids that we have unintentionally pathologized or deemed as problematic are actually a variation of human brain function? The answer is yes. I am about to wow you guys with the most complex infographic I have ever created, and I hope you're ready. It took me longer than you think, guys. This is one of my weaknesses. So this is what we think of when we think of the spectrum. And I don't just mean the autism spectrum. I'm speaking about the neurodivergent spectrum, okay? And I'll use that interchangeably, but I'll try and make that clear when I'm referring to them as different. But essentially, we've got the vast majority of the population here, and we label them as neurotypical, okay? I don't know that if you guys have ever referred to yourselves as that, but yeah, so this is what we see and what we think of when we think of the spectrum. And then we've got this tiny little sliver off in the corner that we call neurodivergent or the spectrum. And so part of the problem with that is that this is actually how our brains classify these same people. We tend to do this thing where when something is different from us, we tend to view it as bad or negative. Our brain just does it. We're not intentionally doing this, so it's not, you've not done anything wrong. But part of the problem is that when we view things in that way, and we're talking about our kids being neurodivergent, we're inadvertently classifying them as abnormal or disordered. Here's what I've found the spectrum actually looks like. In my clinical experience, I have seen very few people, and that's parents and their kids alike, that have absolutely no traits or no qualities that we have determined are neurodivergent. Now, the fact that most of us have traits doesn't mean that we are on the autism spectrum or that we have ADHD, but it does mean that we all have some traits that make each of us a little bit different from one another. But the problem is that we pathologize some of these qualities in our neurodivergent kids that we also see in people who don't identify as being neurodivergent, and I'll go through what some of those mean. I found that the spectrum, the neurodivergent spectrum, is a lot broader than we think, and I don't know how well you guys can see that, but I'll point out some of them. Because I venture to guess if you guys are able to read that list, you'll find at least one of those traits or qualities that you're like, yeah, I have that, or I do that. And so for me, I don't like when certain foods touch on a plate, like scrambled eggs and pancakes and syrup. I don't want my syrup going into my scrambled eggs. That's gross. And I see some of you nodding like, yeah, that's totally gross. It feels very validating for me. Becoming overstimulated in kind of crowded, bustling environments. And so we think of sensory sensitivities or, sensory aversions, right, as being solely a quality of being on the autism spectrum, and that's simply not true. A lot of us do prefer routine and predictability. We just like to know what to expect, okay? But when we talk about, an insistence on sameness, we're usually referring to a diagnostic criteria, something that's gone wrong. So I share a lot of these traits, and that doesn't mean that I'm on the autism spectrum, but what it does mean is that I'm not necessarily neurotypical. Okay, I'm part of that wide range of neurodivergent that I showed you a minute ago. And because the spectrum is broader than we originally thought, we've come to learn that there's actually different profiles or types of people within the autism spectrum specifically. And maybe for some of your kids, this diagnosis, for those of them that have an autism diagnosis, came a little bit later because they didn't fit the classical mold of what we understand as being on the autism spectrum. And so, for those of you that live in Utah, you might see the billboards on the I-15 that will say stuff like, sensory sensitivities is a sign of autism, or avoiding eye contact is a sign of autism. And while that's generally a pretty good litmus, so if you're the parent driving to work on the I-15 and you read that and you're like, maybe I should, look into that more, that's great. But unfortunately, it misses the vast majority of that spectrum and just focuses on that tiny little sliver that I was talking about earlier. Up until fairly recently, we thought about these different adaptations or profiles within the autism spectrum as being exclusive to female-gendered individuals. But we're actually finding out that male-gendered clients are kind of fitting into these different boxes, I guess, or categories. And so I want to go through them really quick. So when we think about the introvert, this is who we think about when we think of somebody on the autism spectrum. If you've seen the show Atypical, you see this high school adolescent male who is uncomfortable with eye contact, finds social engagement and interaction to be very complex and overwhelming, and really stressful. And so for a variety of reasons, they tend to just kind of appear introverted and hang back. But then we also have the opposite, which we call the intrusive extrovert, which I already kind of take issue with that, but let's go with it for a second. So the intrusive extrovert is the opposite of introverted, and so they often get missed when they get diagnosed and get labeled as something else, especially if the adolescent is female. So these are active seekers of social experience. I mean, their passion is to be popular, to have a boyfriend or girlfriend, to be kind of in the center of their group of friends and to just kind of be the it person that in their school. But they tend to have, intrinsic problems reading nonverbal social communication, and so it tends to lead to some pretty intense behaviors that have the opposite effect of what they want. And so, these are the kids that will text their friends 60 times, maybe some of your kids have done this before, and then wonder why their friends are now avoiding them. Or they'll call them 60 times and text and, blow up their social media and stuff like that. And they think, well, I'm showing interest. And so I don't understand why this person now doesn't want to be my friend. Okay, I'm flattering them. After the friendship invariably ends, they are left confused as to why. And it can lead to this sort of black and white, this was my best friend, I love them, they're the coolest human being in the whole world. And all of a sudden, I hate them, they're toxic, I've heard that word a lot, they're just drama. And so there's always some external reason why the relationship has ended, and not really a lot of self-reflection on, well, what was it that I was doing that might have contributed to this? But I want to say that the sneakiest profile, the one that's really difficult to tease apart, is this camouflaging extrovert. Now, we have this stereotype that people on the autism spectrum can't read social cues, they can't read the room. And for some of our kids, the opposite is true. They are keen observers of the way somebody carries themselves, the words they use, the dress, the stuff they choose to wear. And they use that to be able to apply it to themselves. So they start dressing like the people they're referencing and talking like the people they're referencing. But because their brains work a little bit different, they internalize what they're observing as a set of pretty strict rules, okay? So, goth girls don't wear any color except black, so I want to be a goth girl and I will not wear anything except black, okay? So it's a set of rules, and the problem is that while rules are great, there's a lot of nuance and exceptions to those rules, especially when we're talking about our culture and social interaction. And so one example that I think about is I was working with a student and, had social difficulties, that whole thing that we're talking about today. And I was talking to them about what they have tried to do to fit in or make friends. And they said, they were very excited. I saw the movie Clueless. And by now, Clueless is like 30 years old. I mean, it's like a mid-90s movie. But they saw the movie and they saw that the popular girls dress a certain way. Everybody wants to dress like them. Everybody wants to drive the car they drive. And everybody wants to talk the way they talk. And they are super popular. Like, everybody wants to be like them. And one of the phrases that these girls in the movie use over and over again is "as if." And this student that I worked with thought that was so brilliant, and they understood when they should be using that, but they didn't understand that that is an outdated term that most teenage girls no longer use. So they went to school, they started, saying "as if," in the appropriate moments, but were confused when their friends were like, "Nobody says that, that's weird, stop saying that." And so again, it's this idea of like, I've picked up the rule, I've observed it correctly, but I don't necessarily know exactly when to apply it. So what is it that's perpetuating this view that someone else is the problem? It's never us. Researchers have labeled it the double empathy problem. So the theory of double empathy is that when people with very different experiences of the world interact with one another, they're likely to struggle to empathize with each other. And if you think about it, this is the core of breakdowns in communication, and regardless of spectrum, not spectrum, neurotypical, not neurotypical, just between two people. If you come from completely different worldviews, and every single one of us does, we're likely to have a hard time empathizing with each other if we're not actively thinking about trying to take the other person's perspective. But we tend to categorize people on the autism spectrum and also, other neurodivergent conditions as well, like ADHD is, they don't have empathy or they can't take perspective. And really, we're talking about everyone. So why is it that we're labeling them as the problem and not the problem being kind of the breakdown? We're both contributing to this. And so if neurotypical people also can't empathize readily, what do we do about this? So imagine if we took some time to understand someone else's social communication style, especially our kids that are in treatment, how validating that might be to them. We would stop othering them and making them feel like there's something wrong with them. And what I've found is that individuals who are neurodivergent have a different way of relating rather than a deficient one. So I want us to break away from this deficient, less than mentality, because a lot of that is socially and culturally constructed. In our culture, making eye contact is a sign that we are respecting the person who's speaking and that we are attentive to what they're saying. In other cultures, if you make eye contact with somebody, especially someone that's of higher social hierarchy, so think of a parent, a teacher, a boss, you are disrespecting them. In the animal kingdom, when one animal looks at the other animal in the eyes and stares at them, that's a challenge and a sign of intimidation. Okay, you're trying to be the big guy in the pack. So, our whole idea of eye contact is kind of limited to our European culture. But we insist on it and say that this is the one right way to show interest and respect to someone. I also want to talk a little bit about language, because language matters. How we say what we're trying to say matters, because it creates and perpetuates the lens with which we appraise people and our experiences. And so think about the word normal, abnormal. Okay, whenever have you heard the word abnormal referenced positively? If you go get blood work and your doctor calls you and says, we need to go through your results because there was an abnormal number or whatever, you're not thinking, yes, I am not normal. You are concerned and you're worried because something's gone awry, okay? So language matters. And to help our kids, we need to change the lens with which we view their behavior. And so there's a couple of terms that I want to point out that are rather pathologizing. And I'll show you guys some of the criteria that clinicians use to diagnose your kids, and if you look at it from this lens of it's pathologizing, which isn't great, you'll view it a little bit differently, hopefully. But we refer to deficits in social communication. Again, you're not making eye contact, that is deficient, right? Rather than different. We talk about intense, highly focused, circumscribed, and restricted interests, rather than enthusiasms or areas of passion, okay? And this one is not so pathologizing, but I find this really interesting. So when we're talking about somebody on the autism spectrum, we talk about self-stimming behaviors, right? Like body rocking. Think of the stereotypical behaviors, right? Body rocking, hand flapping, okay? But when we're talking about somebody doing very similar behaviors and we either don't know or we don't believe that they're neurodivergent, we refer to it as fidgeting. And we all do it. When we're bored or we're anxious, we all pace, we all bounce our leg, we play with our fingernails, some of us bite our nails, we play with our hair, okay? But again, because we're not reflecting and taking perspective, we think, well, that's a quality of somebody that's on the spectrum. So I'm also not sure if you guys can read this well, but there's a couple of criteria that I would like to point out. And think again from this lens of the pathologizing language. And this is the language that clinicians have long used. It's still, the DSM-5 is our current diagnostic manual. So whenever we're wondering, does this person have this? We open up the DSM And this is the language that we encounter. It's not just with autism, but it's with a lot of other diagnoses. So an abnormal social approach, okay, imagine if somebody thought, man, your social approach is abnormal. Failure of back and forth conversation. And the reason why I put this on a slide is because Matt Lowry is a neurodivergent practitioner, and he's also the parent of a neurodivergent child. And he's brilliantly rewritten these criteria to kind of give us and clinicians some food for thought, okay, to broaden our horizons, I guess. So deficits in nonverbal communicative behavior, deficits in understanding relationships rather than, I would just like to have a different kind of relationship. I don't need to do small talk to have a friend. We can just talk about whatever we're interested. An insistence on sameness and inflexible adherence to routine. So I just want you for a second to stop and think, if we weren't talking about your kid using these terms, if we were talking about you. And when I say we, I mean clinicians that kind of hold the power in that regard, and you're outside of the room, but this is everything they're saying and thinking about you. And because words matter, clinicians are going to approach you from this deficit mentality, and they're just going to view you by all the things you're not, or all the ways in which you're failing, and not look at you as, the way that you process things is different, or you have some strengths that we really haven't understood or tapped into. The other thing that people tend to do is they like to solve problems. When there's a problem, we are naturally driven to take steps to try and fix it. This is, one of the roots of marital conflict, right? Like, I don't want you to fix my problem, I just want you to listen to me. There we go. And so when there's something we don't understand, we tend to label it as negative in relation to us. So when we are interacting with somebody and they're not making eye contact, we view that as negative, and we immediately start to think, they're not listening, they're not respecting us. If they're more focused on what they're playing with their hands, we think, oh, you're not respecting me. When really the opposite could be true. They could be doing that because they want to listen to you, and they need some sort of sensory input to be able to do that. But we're not thinking that in the moment. We're just thinking, why aren't you making eye contact with me? So for our neurodivergent kids, because we've labeled many of their behaviors and characteristics as deficient or negative or weird, we're driven to fix them a lot like we're driven to fix any other problem. Success is defined by how close to normal we can make our kids appear. And this is why we try and force our kids to make eye contact with us when we're speaking, so they can show us that we are respecting them, never mind that we have absolutely no respect for how they are most comfortable communicating. And so I'll talk a little bit in a minute about self-advocacy versus just teaching social skills. I do think there's value in helping our kids understand what neurotypical social skills or interaction looks like, but for the purpose of self-advocacy, not so that they can meet our standard. And so I'll say this a couple of times too, your kids are not the problem. They're individuals who've long been misunderstood and pathologized for who they are. So what we should be doing is seeking to better understand how they work, okay, how they communicate, what their behaviors mean. And so how do we do that? I was going to say something about how it's very complex, but I can't even make the joke. It's actually quite simple. So with understanding, like I said, comes empathy and compassion. Most of the behaviors that we have labeled as autistic or deficient or neurodivergent aren't deficits, but they're actually strategies that your kids have used to stay regulated. And those are exactly the strategies that we have worked so hard to try and rid them of. Okay, so don't rock your body in a classroom. Don't flap your hands in front of your friend when you're super excited about something, because that's not normal. Okay, when maybe they need that movement to contain their excitement, right? Contain their enthusiasm a little bit. So I want you all to always, always ask why. What is the purpose of the behavior and what function does it serve? And that's going to help us move away from our rigid perspective and try and see things from their point of view. So when someone craves routine to navigate and understand their world, it really is no wonder that unexpected change can trigger them and send them into a tailspin. And I'm sure as parents, you've encountered frustrating situations in which your child dysregulates with transitions or when things don't go as they expected. And so I want to flip this a little bit. And this is super important to remember, which is why I made a very complex infographic about it. Your kids crave predictability. We all do to some extent, right? Some of us can just bounce back, more quickly than others. But with routine comes predictability. With sameness comes predictability. And with predictability comes trust and self-regulation. And when your kids don't have that predictability of a routine, they then can't trust anything around them. I want us to think for a minute about the pandemic. We had our predictability, right? Our society is doing just fine. People aren't dying of a virus, generally speaking. And then it happened, and our sense of predictability and therefore trust and therefore self-regulation for some of us kind of went out the window. We couldn't trust. Some of us were conspiracy theorying the government. They introduced this virus or whatever. We were frantic, right? That's when I really saw society as a whole kind of get agitated, much like I see neurodivergent kids that I work with have this internal agitation. When we think about enthusiasms or areas of passionate interests as well, we think about our kids that, will come up to us or their friends and just start talking at us about whatever it is that's on their mind and whatever it is that they're interested in. And we're like, that's weird. You shouldn't do that. Don't talk to me about this. You really should learn to recognize when someone is bored and cut the conversation short. Okay? We don't stop to think about the fact that these kids who find the ambiguity of social interaction so confusing and anxiety provoking, they are choosing to walk up to you and start a social interaction. And in an effort to reduce that ambiguity that they experience, because they want to connect, they want to make friends, they're trying to control the conversation as best as they can, remove those ambiguous social elements. Same thing when they insist that things are done a certain way. Okay, they're just trying to self-regulate, and somehow in there, they recognize that ambiguity, the unknown, the unexpected creates a lot of anxiety for them, and so they want to try and make that go away. They want to fix that. Here's the other thing I'll say about enthusiasms, and I've said this in other presentations too, and this is really important. Information replaces confusion. The more you know about something, like what can I expect out of this presentation? Okay, I'm going to be on a big stage. It's going to remind me of high school dance team, right? The more I can free up my cognitive bandwidth to focus on what I'm actually trying to say. And that's no different with you or your kids, okay? So knowing everything about something makes it known, okay? It makes you the expert in something, and when you've walked every day of your life feeling confused about things that other people don't seem to be confused about, everybody's played Monopoly except for me, that information holds a lot of validation and power for them. And then I also think about movement. I talked a little bit about that repetitive motor movement and how we view it as a bad thing, but yet we all kind of do it to sort of self-regulate, manage our anxiety or our boredom. We soothe babies by rocking them. And so how is this so different? We label the movements of those that are on the autism spectrum, for example, as weird because it looks a little bit different than what we expected. Okay, so there's the irony there again. And when we think about neurodivergence, so including ADHD, autism, some of those diagnoses that I had talked about in the beginning, we aren't often thinking about what trust has to do with it. A lot of us are hardwired to be able to predict the behaviors of others. Okay, I have certain assumptions about what I can expect from all of you, and if you go out of line with that expectation, I'm going to have to figure out a way to rebound pretty quickly, so nobody, so I don't embarrass myself, basically. And so we can read people's body language, we can make inferences based on tone, based on the words they chose to use, how quickly they speak, how loud or not loud they speak. We make conclusions based on that available information. And we use this information to infer the intentions of others. So not just, is this person open to communicating with me or me walking up to them and saying hi, but also their intentions. Okay, and that becomes really important when we're talking about our neurodivergent kids in general, but our neurodivergent kids especially. And so because they don't have that internal rule book to understand someone's nonverbal communication, they tend to overly rely on the content of what people are saying. And so think about your kids and some of their online interactions. I've seen this happen so many times where they meet someone online and they say, yep, I'm totally 16 and I'm totally into what you're into and I think you're so pretty, can you send me a picture? And can you send me another picture? And then can you send me one of those pictures? And it quickly derails. And first of all, it's incredibly validating to be called pretty when you felt different and not that attractive your whole life. But second of all, they're saying they're my age and they're saying that I'm pretty and that they're into what I'm into. So it must be true. Because our neurodivergent kids don't have that internal rule book, for some of them they feel like they can't really trust anyone, especially if the majority of their social experiences have not gone well for them and they're kind of on the periphery of their social milieu. Sometimes the opposite is also true. I refer to autism sometimes as a diagnosis of extremes, both with those sweeping strengths that I was talking about, as well as some of those debilitating weaknesses. ADHD is exactly the same. It's a diagnosis of extremes. How come you can hyper-focus for hours on end on something that you are personally invested in, but if I ask you to sit in class and pay attention to your teacher, you cannot do it for the life of you, and we treat it as if it's a choice. And if we understood that their brains are wired in a way where they can't regulate their attention the same way, we'd understand that it's not really a choice. Maybe some of you have been diagnosed with ADHD and you're like, yeah, totally, makes total sense. So sometimes the opposite is true. Sometimes for our kids, when they don't have the rule book, they then don't know that they shouldn't trust certain people, that some people might have poor intentions. Okay, so there's this idea of don't trust anyone or everyone can be trusted. And the truth is that we should be teaching them how to kind of, assess a situation from the middle. Okay, some people can, some people can't be trusted. And we're also thinking about trust in their environment and in the world. We should be, anyways. I think about the situation around electronics. I'm sure some of your kids, when their iPad dies or their gaming system breaks because they threw a controller in frustration or whatever, they then lose it and you're sitting there thinking, well, you threw the controller or you didn't charge your tablet, so what did you expect would happen? They didn't expect that would happen, and now they're in a tailspin. Their sense of order and what they thought would happen has been violated, and so they can't trust anything around them. Same thing, if I tell one of my students that I'm going to meet with them at 9 a.m. and I show up at 9:15 because there was traffic, I'm so focused on how this is a legitimate excuse, I can't help traffic. They're focused on how I broke a promise. Okay, I told them to expect something of me and I gave them something else. It doesn't matter whose fault it is. So in order to foster trust, we have to change our perspective before asking our kids to change themselves. By persistently giving them the message that they are the ones that need to change, they are the problem, we're telling them that they're not getting it right. And think about the impact that that has on self-esteem, and ultimately it creates a lack of trust. So I want to talk about a couple of ways that we can work to build trust in our kids. And I'm going to go a little bit out of order here because I actually think the most important one is number 4. We ought to be teaching our kids who have been silenced and othered pretty much their entire lives how to advocate for themselves. And in a perfect world, they shouldn't have to, but in a perfect world, you also shouldn't have to speak for them, okay? And so even something as simple as, when I'm standing up here, I need to fidget with something. It just so happens that this clicker has come into use, but really it's kind of cool because I can like pull out this USB thing and I can fidget with something while I'm talking. And when I'm in Zoom meetings with parents, the reason why I have these hair ties is so that I can sit and fidget with them, because that's just what my body needs in order to be able to focus. So if we can teach our kids to say what they need unapologetically, that doesn't necessarily mean that the adults around them are always going to respond in kind, but it teaches them that they have power within them and in the words that they use, okay? Just like we have the right to advocate for what we need and what's okay and not okay with us, your kids have that exact same right. But we're so focused on how they're different, deficient, younger than us, they're not adults, they can't make their own decisions. And self-advocacy holds true for any age, okay? We also don't often think about what their needs are. I mean, we think about it, but then we're just kind of confused and we leave it at that, and then we go ask their therapist, what do they need? I'm thinking about sensory needs, and our kids haven't been taught to look within themselves and think, well, what is it that I need right now? Okay, I need to move around, I need to play with this clicker, I need to play with my hair tie, I'm overstimulated, there's a lot of people in the room, so I need some silence. I don't, it's fine. But just as an example, I need silence, okay, I need to be by myself to kind of recharge. And part of going along with that increase in like, what is it that we need, sensory and otherwise, we also think about building a sensory plan. Okay, so helping your kids recognize that when they're overstimulated, recognize that they are getting overstimulated and be able to self-advocate and say, can I take a break for a minute? I'm getting overwhelmed, okay? So we're not having to forever and ever try and manage their environment and their sources of stress. They're recognizing independently what those are, and they're advocating for what they need. Same thing, if things have just gone too far, like sometimes it does, and they have completely dysregulated, what can they do to get back to a baseline? And that also includes knowing when they need to ask us for help. We can also build trust by embracing their neurodivergent communication style. Again, going with this idea that it's not deficient, but it's different, okay? And along with teaching self-advocacy, I really like and respect when the kids that I'm working with have learned to tell me, if I'm not making eye contact with you, it's not because I'm not listening. It's because I am listening, okay? So I'm then not, making assumptions about their level of engagement. I also think about direct versus indirect communication. We do this weird thing with like direct and indirect communication in our society where we say, be direct and we value direct communication, but when someone is really direct, we kind of take offense to it sometimes. So again, we're sending our kids mixed messages here. And what we try and do to be more polite, and women do this a lot more than men, is that we try and introduce some subtlety or nuance. And so I am more likely to tell somebody, man, your plate of food looks really delicious, rather than say, can I have some of that food? Where can I find that? Where did you get that? Okay. I'm hungry. I would like some food. And speaking of mixed messages, we're often sending our kids messages to be themselves, but then we're also telling them, but like, not like that though. Don't do that, okay? We tell them, be open and honest about how you feel, but stop being so sensitive and extreme, okay? Develop your passions and your interests, but like, don't talk to me about them that long, okay? Can't you read that I'm bored or I'm not interested? I think it's also important to split control, okay? Maybe some of your kids' therapists have coached you on this, where it's like offer a limited amount of choices and allow your child to make a choice from within that. I think that does help provide a lot of structure, and it also gives them a semblance of autonomy and control. But you're also letting them pick from things that you would be perfectly happy with any of those choices, okay? And I also think about using enthusiasms to build connection and trust. So again, coming from this idea that our kids are trying to interact with us or trying to interact with our friends when they come up and just start talking about, whatever it is they're interested in, meet them where they're at, okay? I would never expect somebody to indulge me on my areas of interest all the time, but certainly if that's the only way that I knew to interact with someone without feeling really anxious about it, I would hope that they just grace me for a period of time. But I think it's also important to teach time and place as well. Number 6, I also think is super important. I've thought a lot about this. So an expert is only as good as the lens with which they're viewing neurodivergence or viewing autism or ADHD or whatever it is that we're talking about. And going back to that DSM criteria, if we're talking about deficits in social communication and inflexibility and all of that stuff, that's how we're going to view our kids. And that's how the expert is going to view your kids. And here's the other thing about experts. Anyone can call themselves an expert. This is like a big secret that I'm going to let you guys know about. Anyone can call themselves an expert. There is no industry standard for what an expert is, but a lot of parents tend to equate expertise with time. You've been doing this for 30 years. And I love when parents, when I'm getting to know parents and they approach me and they say, well, my child has worked with Dr. So-and-so and from Princeton University, or they started the Stanford program of, underwater basket weaving. I don't know. And they are the expert and they hang on to every word they say, and then they look at me and they're like, man, you look really young, you can't be an expert. And I'm like, I could call myself whatever I want. And so some of the most tone deaf, out of touch professionals that I have ever met and worked with are the experts that have been doing this for 30 years. Okay, so don't look for the expert necessarily. There's certainly value in, putting in the time and, working with thousands of people and all of that stuff. But if that's all you're looking for, you might miss working with somebody that may not have been doing this for 30 years, but is always trying to strive to understand you and understand your child and not see them as just a label, okay? Oops. There we go. So by now your kids have heard a lot about what they can't do or don't do well. And that doesn't just affect self-esteem, it also affects identity. Many neurodivergent people find that when they embrace their neurodivergence as an identity, they can start focusing a little bit more on their strengths while also being aware of things that they're not great at. I tell people all the time, I am not tech savvy. So if something goes wrong with this, I'm gonna look to an IT person and say, please help me, okay? But I'm very good at other things, okay? Technology is just not one of them. The other thing is that when they start to embrace this as an identity full of strengths and areas of struggle, they also find community. They find others with similar experiences. And when you've been locking yourself in your room, hanging out on Discord for months and months, you don't really have that sense of community like you think you do. And I also want to talk about a very particular label that I find that a lot of parents and clinicians tend to use as well, and talk a minute about its impact. What does high functioning or low functioning mean? I'm a psychologist and I don't know exactly what it means. Now, first of all, if I were talking about any one of you and I said, oh, that, Tony, he's real low functioning, guys, so give him some grace. Nobody wants to be talked about in that way, okay? And so we actually have no industry standardized definition of what high functioning and low functioning is. There's no commonly accepted definition. It puts people in a dichotomy, and we do it all the time, okay? We have no problem talking about other people in this language, but in ways that we ourselves would not want to be talked about. It's overly simplistic, and it collapses the person's unique strengths and challenges. When it comes to being a psychologist, I am very high functioning, I like to think. When it comes to technology, I am so low functioning. Like, when it comes to being, having a sense of direction, I will tell people, pretend I am 20 IQ points lower than I seem and navigate me based on that. Because that's just not one of my strengths, okay? But I certainly wouldn't want to be called low functioning or high functioning, because all of us, including your kids, are great at some things and not so great at others, okay? That is no different. Being neurodivergent, being on the spectrum, being autistic is not a disorder, okay? And I'm having a harder and harder time the longer I do this, referring to autism as a disorder. It's just a different way of being human, and it's a variation of human functioning. I'm not saying that neurodivergent people aren't different. I'm saying they are, and that's not a problem. So again, your children are not the problem. They're not struggling with their mental health because there's something wrong with them. They're struggling because they've lived every day of their life in a world that they understand less and less, and that was not built for them. And on top of that, society has sent them the message repeatedly that there is something wrong with them. And it's my hope that they start to undo all of those labels and expectations that society has put on them, and that they start to see themselves as individuals with sweeping strengths and not just the sum of their weaknesses. And so I want you guys to take a look around you for a minute. And I can already see some people awkwardly avoiding eye contact with their neighbor, which I love because it just illustrates my point, okay? So this is your community. Okay, these are parents that have gone through some similar experiences as you, and even if they've gone through wildly different experiences, they've certainly felt common emotions. And so there's your community. And likewise, your kids that are here at Spark Academy have found their community for the very first time. They see that there are people that are like them, that like the same things as them, okay? I tell parents all the time, sometimes your kids just need to find their people, okay? And you need to become one of their people. So I want to close this keynote by saying that you and your kids are on a journey. And the best journeys always seem to be the ones that are taken together. If you guys don't know Shane Curran, he's a pretty cool guy. He's a guy that was in treatment, struggled with substance addiction, and he identifies as neurodivergent. And it wasn't until he went into treatment and recognized that he worked a little bit differently, and that's why he's been pathologized, okay, for who he is. So, like I said, I want your kids to view themselves for their strengths and not just their weaknesses. And if you guys can leave today and start thinking about how you might contribute to that, then I have done my job. I can drop the mic, but I will not, because that makes a very unpleasant noise. And so I will not do that. But I appreciate you guys taking the time to sit and listen to me chat about this. Thank you. So I am happy to answer any questions, discuss anything except things I'm not willing to discuss. Yeah, you had your hand raised?
So, I think we all get that we need to, as parents and families, need to watch our labels. How do we get other people around us to do that they're changed and that too? Because our son is like, uses a crutch, oh, I'm diverse, I'm autistic, I can't succeed. So how do we change teachers and friends and the people you run into in the grocery store, in that area? How do we change that?
So I'm going to talk out loud about this for a minute. So you're not going to change, the person at the grocery store to where, hopefully you get them to think about how they're saying what they're saying. But I've found that the way it's been most effective for me is in the language that I choose and model to other people. When I write reports, psych reports after testing, I don't refer to things as deficient. I'm happy to refer to things as weaknesses or areas of struggle. But all you can do is control the language that you use. And you are one of the most important people in your child's life. The person at the grocery store is not. They're still going to have an impact if they say something unkind, but it starts with you and teaching your kid to self-advocate, and also you modeling that you don't view their characteristics as deficient. Does that kind of make sense? I wish I had, if I had the formula for like how to get the person at the grocery store or the teachers to consistently not do that, I would write a book, it would be on Amazon, I would tell you all to buy it. So, but it starts with you. Yeah.
So, it seems to me that one of the challenges is on one hand, say to be telling our child, look, you should accept yourself, we accept you. At the same time knowing that there'll be a lot of people who won't accept you unless you act as other than you are. And there's essentially a reward and punishment because of the desire for acceptance for other people. Where's the line between self-advocacy and say, hey, you can't be true to yourself in order for other people to accept you?
I don't think there's a single person on this planet that will be accepted for absolutely everything that they are. And so I think the important thing is that they advocate to be accepted in areas that are important to them. And this kind of goes back, we're talking about how all of this is super important, right? I have talked to kids and told them, hey, do you know that you're on the spectrum? And let's talk about how cool that is. And they're like, meh. It's not that important to them, maybe not yet or maybe ever, because it really doesn't change anything internally about them. And so I would say focusing on what are the parts of themselves that are important to them. So just as a random example, and I've shared this with some parents, I am an anime video game geek. Okay, I was that teenager and now I am that adult, and as a teenager I was terribly embarrassed about it because that's not what the cool kids were doing. And now I don't care if somebody doesn't like it, but it's because while I like it, it's what I'd like to do in my free time, it's not central to my identity. If it was, and I am a professional video game streamer, I would hope that I have the ability to self-advocate and say, you know what, if you don't like it, I'm still going to go to bed at night. I'm still going to collect my big, video game streamer paycheck. And so at the heart of it, it kind of doesn't matter what you think. Okay, so I want your kids to be able to talk to other people who challenge them in that way, the way I just talked about it. I literally don't care. I want you to accept me. Everybody wants to be liked. But if you have a hang up with what I'm interested in doing in my free time or how I collect my super awesome video game streamer paycheck, then I go to bed just the same, I wake up just the same, I collect my paycheck just the same. So, yes.
How do you help your clients, your kids, learn to do that when so much of teenage is about acceptance from others? And we can say that because as you get older and more mature, you find the people you find, of course, you find more
What's interesting about that is that conforming is it's based so much on the milieu that you're around. And so I venture to guess that your kids being here at Spark Academy probably feel like they are more accepted and more with their people, and their peers here have more grace around their quirks, right, and the things that make them who they are. But if you put them in a public high school or a public middle school, it would be a completely different story. We're all driven to find acceptance and be liked, but the environment in which we do that has a lot to do with it. And so that's why I tell kids to find your people, meaning find your environment and the people in it. They're not going to be accepted by everyone. I'm not accepted by everyone, and nobody here is accepted by everyone. No, not everyone's going to like you, is what we tell our kids. But I want them to be aware of the environments in which they do feel comfortable. And accept that there's going to be some times in life when they are going to be in an environment that necessarily will make them uncomfortable. And what parts of themselves do they want to shine versus what parts of themselves do they want to minimize? So when I'm in a professional conference, when I'm presenting, I don't go on and on about video games and anime, but when I'm with kids who I know are into that, we go on and on about it, and it's a great conversation. And so I just naturally, I have this understanding, and I've had to learn over time, these are the people that I can be myself with in this way. These are the people that I can be myself with in this way. And so environment has a lot to do with it, which you guys already know, because that's part of the reason why your kids are here and not public middle school, high school. Yes.
So I feel very selfish asking this question, and I haven't ever said this out loud, but I keep hearing, the on the spectrum really thrive on routine and schedule, but I thrive on freedom and being able to do what I want to do at the spur of the moment. And so I don't know if you can help me figure out how do you draw the line of having a routine and a schedule for your child, but also knowing that you need what I need more freedom because I have needs and my child has needs. So how do you balance those two things when they're so different?
Are you talking about you as a parent need freedom, but your kid needs kind of structure and
Not even as a parent, just as a human being.
Okay.
Just as a person, if I, I'm having a really bad day, I just want to, go to a theme park or something, or whatever. I just want to, go do something, because, that's just how I'm feeling today. We have very flexible jobs, and so, we can have a very fluid life, so, I guess I can't really wrap my head around, what that looks like to, not just, give my child what they need, but also, I'm a person, and I have, needs and desires and things too, and sometimes they're different.
Yeah. You're actually describing something that I would argue is the case with a lot of people, right? We're all different in terms of how much routine we need versus how much flexibility we need. And if you are somebody that has autism and ADHD, you are, you're kind of in a bit of a conundrum, because for a lot of people on the spectrum, they want routine predictability, but your ADHD makes it to where you like things to just be open and free. So you're having to kind of toggle back and forth between both. And just thinking out loud about this, I think about the notion of being able to compromise. You're not always going to get your freedom and flexibility, and your kid's not always going to get routine and predictability just by function of life. You're also not going to get your, freedom and kind of doing things in kind of a free form way just by function of life. And so you have to think in a particular situation, what is the goal here? So is the goal in this particular situation, whatever it is, to help my kid feel more comfortable, because if this goes outside of their predictability and routine, they're going to they can't remain regulated? Or is it more important? And this isn't, you label it as selfish. I don't think it's selfish. This is what you need to be, to be a person in the world. Or is it more important right now for me to get my, go to the theme park because I've had a rough day? If I don't do that, I then can't be a good parent to my kid and then provide them with the routine and predictability that they are wanting. So you're never going to find a situation where you get both unless you don't coexist. And so whenever I'm trying to figure out which one I should do, I think about what is the goal here, what is going to do the most good. And sometimes it's predictability and routine. Sometimes it's, no, I just don't go by the schedule and just do what I want when I want. I'm one of those people that I need both. I need to know what to expect out of my day, but if my bandwidth is running low, I like to just step back and take a break and not talk to people. And so I understand the conundrum intimately. So I'm always having within myself to toggle what is important here. Is rescheduling this meeting and giving myself more time to myself and more bandwidth gonna be more beneficial, or is just saying, you know what, I'm not going to reschedule this meeting because it's just going to cause me more heartache down the road. So I just need to do that. I need to do what was scheduled and planned. Yeah.
I'm going to fumble this, but I think there's a loneliness that occurs when you're the parent of an autistic or neurodiverse child, because in your orbit, there's people that care, whether they be family or friends. They want to help, but it's almost impossible to get them to understand at times what you're going through. Especially often, not to use the terms that you don't like, but often when they at times see a very normal, I'll call it high functioning, but I
Yeah.
don't like the word, but high functioning individual. So it creates a bubble around you as a parent again. I mean, everyone's trying to help. You want to be kind to those trying to help because it's based on love and care. But I'm sometimes at a loss as to how to explain, the situation to them in a way that's not hurtful to them or dismissive, but at the same time, appreciative. And it's been a conundrum for me, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how to navigate that situation. I mean, you want to be respectful and kind, but at the same time, it almost becomes noise because they aren't living in your shoes. And if you say that, it's completely dismissive to them. So it just gets, I'm just interested in your thoughts.
So I don't know if this is the right answer, the answer you're looking for, but I've noticed that when you have a friend group and they all love you, they all want to help you, we tend to go to different friends for different things. And so, you have your ride or die friends, you can tell them anything that you want, doesn't matter how bad it makes you look, and they're gonna say, yeah, let's do this, let's figure this out. But then you have some of your other friends that are gonna tell you, hey, that's not the right thing to do. And you kind of cherry pick, like, who am I gonna talk to about this thing so that you get a very particular response. And so I would probably encourage you to think about, out of this group of people that you're talking about, who can help, in this way, or this person wants to help in this way. Are they really the best person to do that, or is it actually this other person? And I think part of being helpful is being understanding with what somebody is going through, and rather than focusing on common experiences, because maybe they don't have a neurodivergent child, so they wouldn't have that common experience, I think about common emotions. So they might not have a neurodivergent child like you do, but they certainly know what it's like to be lonely and kind of on an island about something. And they certainly know what it's like to feel like they're at their wits' end and they are failing as a parent. Every parent, has had that. And so I've found when I want to help people feel validated for wanting to help versus, just saying, hey, you don't understand, so you can't help me, is I try and get them to understand my emotion without focusing so much on my experience. So I want to be mindful of the time. Yep. Okay. So I'm here. I'm excited for you guys to spend time in lovely Utah, and those are my email addresses. Do not hesitate to reach out to me. Okay.